our spirits could kill. I see a lot of people walking around with tombstone bare eyes.
A number of years back, I became fascinated with poetic forms in non-European languages. This was partly inspired by reading some of the commentaries on poetic translation by Nabokov. He presenting in varying points of his career arguments for and arguments against translation of poems that don't retain the structure of the original, don't retain the meter of the original, in favor of trying to maintain the flavor of the original. The most eloquent argument for both sides of that issue, either for or against, that I've encountered are by Nabokov. He argues for it in some points of his career. He argues against his own arguments in other points of his career. So you can, if you're at all interested in the problems of translating poetry, you need look no further than Nabokov to find very eloquent arguments for virtually every position. One has to give some credit to the academic who has no issue with contradicting himself almost on a week-by-week basis. But the interest that this sparked is given. I'm looking over the writing of Nabokov and finding so much passion and so much fire on the problem of how do we retain form, how do we retain flavor, and which is most important. That it got me interested in that question: how much is lost? And to me, one of the most compelling verse forms of contentious translation is the Mayan poetry, often mistaken as prophecy, in the Chilam Balam. It's got a very, very distinct form. A very distinct form, very distinct flavor, and while I never picked up enough Mayan to really appreciate it in its natural language, some of the English transliterations that I found contain powerful and resonant verses. I mean, lines like "Weep, weep, weep, but cease your weeping, for ash feels no sorrow." Like, just powerful declarations of despair, but hope nestled within despair. Considering that many of these verses were written as Mayan culture was being annihilated by the Spanish, the historical context for the interplay between hope and despair just captured my imagination, and I tried my hand juxtaposing some of that flavor to modern problems and modern perspectives. In that, in many ways, we are in a similar historical cultural position, except that we find ourselves struggling with the question of whether we are the Mayans or whether we are the conquistadors, or whether perhaps we are both, whether we are an essentially culturally self-annihilating people. And so this got me to thinking, and thinking usually gets me to writing, and eventually writing gets me to writing something roughly coherent, and that gave me this. Windthroat howls through broken cities, not to grease its teeth but ash, cloud thundering thick as flies, stalking meat between the ruins. Huts of hollowed glass and steel ring shivering wealthy men, eating fear of outside noises. Something moves within the dust. Sages rise from cooling fevers, artist reglazes shattered wit. Listen to the voices calling. Something moves within the dust. Starving ashmen hear the sages, tremble at the scrawl of art. Amidst the breaking of the world, something moves within the dust. Not from molding of the towers, not for asking to be wanted, not from cracked, expectant ruin, something moves within the dust. From the fragments of the wise, sewn in silt of plentied men, a voice renewed to anguish cries, something moves within the dust. Fires stoked grant heart no succor, toppled walls protect no backs. Expected wounds itch with vigor. Something moves within the dust. Woe who thought their time accursed. Woe who thought the worst had come. Woe who fear only a failing. Something moves within the dust. It's perpetually curious to me, curious and interesting, the interplay between our denial of and the invariable and inescapable evocation of our primordial fears. This is a thing that we find most eloquently and simultaneously most often incompetently expressed in horror media. That we can remind people, that we can still evoke in people a primal response, a primal fear, that we can project people into a place, into a consciousness, into a state of being wherein we can appreciate why our ancestors felt the need to surround themselves by fire. It's such a defiant and yet desperate act to bring light where there is not light, to retain some sense of mastery over the darkness through artifice, through construct, that we build high walls, ringed with spikes, parapets with sharpened tops around our villages, that we keep watchfires burning well into the night, and that we post watchmen, even though we may know, even though our ancestors knew, that the likelihood of attack was very slim, that the shadows, in all likelihood, contained nothing that humans need be concerned about, and yet, this is most particularly interesting to me in observing our responses to things for which we should have no response. The idea of unnatural, impossible sounds, that we would respond to sound that has no corollary, that has nothing in our experience to ground it to a concept or a reaction of fear, is intriguing to me. Consider the sound of claws clicking on a tile floor. Approaching. Closer. Closer. We have no experience with this sound to tell us that this is a thing we should dread. We have no experience with this sound. Our ancestors had no experience with this sound, because the world of talons and the world of tile floors have ever been separated, and that is perhaps the grounding of that fear. The idea that from our primordial past, that from a world that inspired us to build watchfires, inspired us to build spiked parapets, that from this world we would have an invader, an intruder, crashing into a world that no longer keeps watch over the darkness.